Hello, everyone. How are you? Can you hear me at the back? Tell me if I speak too quickly or if you can't understand. I believe she just said that my name is Jamie Allen, and I'm here from Copenhagen, actually. But I was going to today sort of talk a little bit about my own background, a little bit about the institute that I now work at and am head of research at. And then I'm going to speak a little bit about some artistic projects that sort of work in a certain vein within art and technology and interaction design. We're actually here to do with my partner Bernhard Garnisnig, who's sitting at the back, a workshop with some wonderful folks who are joining us in the studio over there, where we're using a number of different kinds of audio technologies to kind of investigate the infrastructure of the city and the urban space. These are just photos from today of some folks doing electromagnetic field recordings in the Strelka building, including the microwave oven. So that's why we're here, and thanks for coming tonight. So hi, I'm Jamie. I sort of have an artistic practice that relates a lot to research culture, and so I'm often one of these people with a hyphenated name, like artist researcher or researcher artist or one of these kinds of things. I'm very concerned with sort of how knowledge is created and how artistic practice can be kind of one of the modes of that. I'm originally from Canada. I lived in New York for a while in the UK, and now I live in Denmark. A few of the communities that might be kind of interesting vis-a-vis, especially Strelka as an institute that I've been involved with in the past, are this interactive telecommunications program at NYU at the Tisch School, and then the I-Beam art and technology space in New York, which is just a sort of interesting space if people are aware of it. I worked for a long time as a museum designer, so I was doing a lot of interactive design for museum spaces, and that's kind of what spiraled me into research culture along with artistic practice. I worked also at this place called the Culture Lab in the UK, which is another sort of interesting institute. I seem to gravitate towards places like Strelka. I'm a fan of cross-disciplinary institutes. And right now I work at a place called the Copenhagen Institute of Interaction Design, which is far too long, so everyone just calls it CIID. Now, CIID is, again, a little bit like Strelka in the sense that it's a private institute. It has a one-year master's course, and we do a kind of school, but it also has a research and consulting wing, and so we're one of these interesting entities that somehow relates to academic culture, but also has a big relationship to industry and hopefully the real world, so to speak. These three things relate kind of with overlapping activities. You know, on the consulting and research side, we do a lot of collaborative research with industry, so we do a lot of projects with large medical manufacturers and shipping companies and things like that. But we also do really kind of speculative artistic research, which is kind of my focus. This is where Denmark is, in case anyone doesn't know. This is what the space looks like. It's a very studio-oriented environment. We work with the students. It's very collaborative. It's very interdisciplinary, as I said. It's very focused on this idea of prototyping and making while you research. So we do a lot of kind of interaction design type research where we'll make a probe and put it into a public space and then ask people to react to it. So a lot of it's around, I don't know, people know things like DIY electronic scenes like Arduino and processing and these kinds of technologies. And then, of course, we have a 25-person master's course, which is structured in 3 tiers. And so even though we're always emphasizing these kinds of practice-based learning and practice-based research, we first start with technologies as a kind of teaching method. So we get some of the really amazing world-class teachers of things like processing, and we actually have the original developer of Arduino is the person who teaches it at CID. And then the students do, after that, they do kind of investigations in specific areas of interaction design, and then they do a final project. I'm mostly just presenting this so that I can show some of the student work in a minute. So these are the kinds of things that they come up with. And I'll just show a few projects. We try to push this idea that we're close to the real world in our teaching, but at the same time, what we've found, of course, is that this is the environment where the students can do the most sort of strange and critical projects. And so even though we're interested in what sort of real problem someone can solve in the world in terms of their research, it's often the case that the final projects are somewhat artistic or somewhat critical or somewhat speculative. which is something that I really love about the place. So the first project I'll show is by a student named Yufan Wang, and his practice is really about trying to take Eastern thinking and Eastern methodologies for meditation and for mindfulness and this sort of world into the West. And so he made an interesting kind of intervention into the iPhone app space that deals with this.
My name is Jack. I'm a beginner to spiritual practice. Like all the other practitioners, I want to explore my spiritual world, find my inner peace, and reach an everlasting happiness. I have put in some effort. I tried to meditate and meditate. It worked a couple of times, but it's really hard for me to maintain the progress. Might be because there are so many delusions in life. Women, money, endless work, and no spare time. This situation hasn't changed for a long time until I found this to help me break the ice. Easier for me to come to the higher state of mind, and I can always use it to discover something new. What I need is just to find a quiet place, take it out, and connect to my iPhone. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot to tell you what I'm talking about. It's called Channel of Mindfulness, a device to help inexperienced people like me reach mindfulness and inspire spiritual growth. Let me show you.
So just in the interest of time, I'll move forward. So this is the kind of project that comes out of the course. It's a kind of provocation in a certain sense to the whole kind of buzzing information culture of app development, and it also is a kind of practical thing. It works quite well actually when you try it. I'll show maybe one or two more projects. So this is Sarah Krugman. She is a diabetic, and she's interested in the interaction design for the healthcare space. So how can technologies help people sort of communicate better with their own bodies and understand the data that comes out of their own bodies? And so she had this idea to use art therapy as a way of understanding some of those kinds of ideas. So I'll just play it. This is her final project from last year.
Hi, it's very nice to be here with you. We'll get to know each other bit by bit. Let's start with setting up my me. The paint and the card set is here for you to make your own metaphors for your blood sugar data. Underneath a water cup is a stack of cards. Some are pre-filled with symptoms of low and high blood sugars, but some are left blank for you to fill in your own. What do you associate with each symptom? Can you paint a symbol, pattern, or shape that means that to you? When you are finished, download the MyMe app. It will guide you through entering the scales that you've set up so that you can see your data in a personalized way, in a way that makes sense to you.
So again, in the interest of time, it's quite a long video actually. So the idea there is, again, solving a kind of real problem, but being very provocative about the way that people represent medical data, right? So it's a kind of research project with an artistic orientation. I'll skip through a couple slides here just because I think these are also quite long and we're running a bit late. So I'm a head of the research group at this institute, and we do a kind of a number of different themes in our research. We're really concerned with how people use technology, right? It's a kind of general and very cross-disciplinary sort of pursuit. We have 4 different areas that we're looking at: learning, which is kind of technologies for everyday learning; cultural context, which is museum installations and things like that; aging and well-being, which is a whole area devoted to trying to make technologies to allow people to live at home longer later in life; and big data and open data is a kind of concern around visualization and techniques for dealing with big data. We have a lab, which is basically a place where we put out little tiny projects and sketches and things. I would recommend you go to the website and find some of the tools that we've developed. So some of the projects that we've done have developed these little kits for doing things like being able to read sensor data into an iPhone and things that can really help student projects, for example, get done. One of them is called Accessory, which is a kind of a tool set for iPhones, again, to be able to kind of sketch data coming into an iPhone. Another one of these is a Haptics Toolkit. So if anybody knows about haptics, which is a kind of a technology for touch and being able to sketch touch interactions, there's a wonderful Haptics Toolkit on that site as well. So what I'm going to do is just kind of jump ahead a little bit to the sort of more conceptual realm, I suppose. So my own research and the way that I think about these sort of technologies has sort of come a long way through being an artist and a researcher and a technologist. And the title of the talk is Interacting Infrastructures. One of the things that sort of concerns me a lot is what we think about as an infrastructure, right? So this whole sort of history of thinking of infrastructural elements as being something that's kind of new and technological and maybe only of the 20th century is a little bit false, right? Because we've always had this sort of underlying world that we've used and kind of a material sense. So the comparisons I'm making here are between the sort of the natural resources that we often sort of think of as being kind of already present in the world, and the things that we've now created in cities, for example, which have become almost like new natural resources, right? So we have these infrastructures which we don't think about, and one of the things we're doing in the workshop this week is looking at things like the electromagnetic spectrum that we've created in the city, which of course is a kind of infrastructure that we can always tap into, a little bit like air, water, the kind of the natural resources. How we interact with these things is really important to me as well. So how we kind of contact them in a respectful way and allow the agency of those infrastructures to kind of presence themselves. So this is both a kind of call to an ecological type of thinking, but it's also a thought about how similar it is to interact with technologies, that it's similar to interact with technologies in the sense that it's a complex arena of materials, right? It's a lot like the natural world in that sense. And so we have to be kind of careful about how we create, for example, creative tools, right? The analogy between the control structures of the way that we do things like control factories and the way that we make music or make buildings or do anything creative is far too tight in a certain sense, right? It's all about controlling that world. Whereas if you thought of that world as more of a natural resource, you might be a little bit more of a foreigner in that land and kind of and allow yourself to be controlled by it. Just as a kind of reference point, like the way that I think about artwork, this is a picture of Friedrich Nietzsche when he was not looking so good in his later life. He had this principle that was, I think, really influential for me in terms of thinking about the way that we make creative things in the world and how we use them to understand the world, right? This is Apollo and Dionysus. In his Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche talked about how there really are just these two opposing forces in artwork, right? Which is, one is that you kind of use illustration or narrative or new narrative to create a layer on top of the world. And a lot of design and a lot of engineering and a lot of architecture is like that. It kind of covers things up, right? It puts a mask on it, or it puts a new metaphor on top of it. Whereas, and that's a kind of a Dionysian element in artwork and creative work. In the Apollonian sort of world is more this idea of trying to uncover and make things more obvious and make things kind of learnable and seeable within artistic practice. And of course, now our gods sort of look like this, which is Pandora opening her Dropbox. Another kind of interesting reference is Heidegger, who talks a lot about this standing reserve, right? Which is the transition between this moment in human history and this one, where we started to think of nature and the kind of the infrastructure of nature as something that was just there for us to use. And it was a continuously sort of available reserve of materials. And again, now our reserves are essentially technological. And so what does that do to the possibility of kind of art making within all these systems and creative work in general, architecture, design? I should say that this all sort of revolves around a set of thinking that I'm super interested in, which I'm sure people know Bruno Latour's work about trying to allow the agency of objects to come forth and think about non-human actors in these sorts of situations. Object-oriented ontology, speculative realism are kind of philosophical movements. There's a small plug here for a very wonderful journal that I work on with a few other people, which sort of talks about some of these ideas. But another way of talking about all this stuff is to talk about toilets. So that's a toilet. In 1987, there was a Super Bowl game in the US, which was a really big deal. It was two teams that kind of hate each other, and they're both sort of in areas which are huge football sort of fan cities. It was the New York Broncos and the Denver Giants. I was quite a young person, but I remember there being this thing talked about called the super flush, which was during the sporting game. What happens is, of course, there's a halftime period where everyone gets up because they've been drinking so much beer to take a pee, right? And there was an article in a few papers by this really strange guy named Harvey, who was the city commissioner of New York at the time, and he was trying to urge people to not flush the toilet at the same time, right? The big concern is that if everybody flushed their toilets right at the moment of halftime during the game, that somehow the Hudson River would empty, and there would be this incredible rush of water, and the whole sewage system would explode, and this was called the super flush, right? It turns out that Harvey is a bit of a jerk. He actually just did it because he wanted to run for city election the next year, and he really just wanted his name in the paper, and so he made up this story about the super flush, and it was all a big kind of made up thing. But what's wonderful about that story, right, is that when you create a kind of false narrative like that, all of a sudden everybody in the city is aware that their toilets are connected to something, right? They know all of a sudden that when they flush, it's actually connected to their neighbor's toilet, and it's actually coming from the Hudson River, and all these sort of infrastructural issues come out. And there's a lot of different ways you can think about how important that is. One of the importance is, of course, that when we stop thinking about our infrastructures as present, things like this happen. And this is probably hard to see, but it's the blackout in New York, right? And this is because we didn't pay attention to the infrastructure of the grid. So, you know, if Harvey had been around, it might have been a bit different. That was the period when, you know, half of the northern seaboard of North America went out. Other more serious examples are things like, you know, nuclear power infrastructure and whether or not we notice these. This is a picture from the most recent flood in New York City. And I don't know if people know about this, but there was a period when only the lower part of Manhattan didn't have power, which of course is the most poorer part of Manhattan. And so there was people running up to 24th Street just to plug in their phones for a little while. And some nice folks sort of put out power for people. But again, it's these moments of both kind of catastrophe and then also, you know, guys like Harvey doing things that sort of present the infrastructure, meaning give them to you, show them to you, that I find really interesting. There's a history of this in art practice, actually, which is something that I'm very happy about, right? This is a thing called the electric sportsman, which was actually a product you would buy in the 19th century, well, you know, 1880s to the 1920s. And the essence of this was just to bring it home. What happened was you charged up this jar and the little man, and there would be a little spark that would go between the two contacts. And it was just an object to have in your house. But the whole point of it was to reflect on electricity, right? There was just this moment where you'd think electricity, and you'd be aware of it for a little while. And so this is a kind of nice tradition. There's work by people like Namjoon Paik, who is a video artist in the 60s and 70s. This is called Magnet TV, for pretty obvious reasons. But what's interesting about it to me is it's a sculptural piece where he just took a normal 1950s television and put a gigantic magnet on the top of it. But what you get out of that is this whole like kind of narrative or story about how TV works, right? That it has a magnetic wave in it, and there's some kind of relationship there that you can experience, which brings out the infrastructure of how television's built. In design practice, right, this is the product that saved Apple, and it had a transparent back. And this was one of the things that in design culture, it was like, why would you ever show the electronics? But it was a huge seller because it kind of made the computer more friendly. You saw what it was doing inside. In architecture, we have examples like the Pompidou Center, right, which is a kind of inversion of the infrastructure. It shows you everything that's happening. So there's a lot of other examples of this sort of thing in other cultural spheres, right? Like this is what I think sort of I can, in a way, trace a lot of the DIY and maker culture and all this stuff that resulted in and created open source cultures back to that kind of avant-garde movement in a way. The moment of like saying, I don't want to create new narratives in that Dionysian sense. I want to show you what's really happening. I want to show you the material reality of the infrastructure that you live in. So, you know, maybe Harvey Schultz is just a really good artist, right? And maybe I want to make work like Harvey Schultz. And so this is a piece that I showed earlier, which is called Natural Resources. And what we did is a friend of mine and I, a guy named Ian Curry, found all these public outlets in New York City and just did very domestic things like iron shirts or make toast in various parts of the city. And what's amazing about this, of course, is that you never notice these plugs. There's plugs in public spaces where you can get electricity all over New York City. And they're used for things like mowing the lawn or trimming the hedges, but they're actually live. And the thing we realized also is that while we were doing this, like in this particular case, someone came up to me and said, "What are you doing? Like, are you allowed to do this?" And I realized it was the security guard. And he just didn't even know like who was paying for that plug. And there's even one in Central Park that's covered by a tree root, you know? So this is where you get the mixture of like what we think of as natural and what we think of as infrastructural and technological. And once you know about these public outlets, you might do something like this. And this is a project I talked about during in the workshop a bit, so some of you have heard this. But once I realized that there was this power infrastructure, this natural resource in the city that I could use, I started thinking, what could I use it for, right? And these are a set of small little micro radio transmitters It was a project called RoboPoems, where we used all these little points in the city where you can just access power for free. And we installed a number of these little micro transmitters. The transmitters were actually poetry that was written by a friend of mine in these specific locations. And so as you walked by, as long as you were tuned into one of the frequencies that they were transmitting on, you would get these lovely little poems. And then there was an online map. You could kind of figure out where they were. So that's a story a little bit about, like, discovering infrastructure and then using it creatively to both show that infrastructure to people, but then also use it in a kind of another way. This is a project I did a few years ago called Last Laugh. Down here is a tape loop which is playing a 1970s laugh track. So it's just a bunch of people laughing really loud. It's hooked up to a speaker that's actually shaped like a rock, so it has this weird naturalism as well. And then all of that is powered by a wind generator, right? So this thing sits in actually the Northumbria forest, and whenever the wind blows loud enough, it just laughs at you. And this was this idea of, like, how do I make sculpture in an electronic sort of new media sort of genre that might actually last forever, right? So if you hook this up, as long as the wind's blowing, even if there's a nuclear blast, it'll still be laughing at you kind of forever. This is taking that thinking a little bit further and a little bit more practical. So this is a project we were commissioned, I think maybe like 4 years ago now, which was to create something that would go into these new beach huts that were being built on the northeast coast of England, right? So we were asked to somehow respond to this structure. And the first thing we thought of course, was something we're both sort of technologically based artists, and so we wanted to do something that involved lighting or energy. But the second part was, well, if we're going to do this, we should be considerate about how that energy is created, right? It happens to be on the northeast coast of England, so there's lots of wind, there's wind farms around. And so the interesting creative process was, well, if we install a wind generator, how much power do we have in order to create a piece, right? Which is not the way artists usually think. I mean, usually you don't think that much, for one thing, about energy at all. But if you did, you would think, okay, well, I'll make this beautiful object and it'll take this much power, and that's sort of how it'll work. And then I'll create whatever sort of infrastructure is required to power that piece. We decided to sort of take it the other way. If we could hook up one of these sort of wind generators, how much power do we have? And could we use that as a creative constraint, right? So it's a little bit like an engineering constraint that becomes a creative constraint. And in the end, we installed just a small number of sort of cedar panels became lights. And so we were able to kind of do these wonderful dynamic lighting based on the wind as it came through. So I'll just speak about one more project, and then maybe we can chat or discuss other things. So this is probably the largest piece that I've done that is really about a kind of media infrastructure, right? So the project's called Refractive Index, and it does take a bit of background. There's a large project that happened right before the Olympics in the UK, which was to install large media screens all over the country. And it was part of this thing called the Big Screens Project, appropriately enough. And it was right before the Olympics, so the idea was that during the Olympics you could go down to the screen and you would watch your local swimming hero winning the gold or in the competitions. But the strange thing about it is that this is not a thing you could get away with in a lot of countries. Like, to install, I think in the end there was something like 37 of them all over the country, but only in England, only with the BBC, would you really get the kind of permissions to do that in every city in the UK. So it's a strange kind of Orwellian movement to take a bunch of giant televisions and put them in the middle of your town square. But because the BBC is such a trusted entity in the UK, it happened. But what I got interested in when I first got asked to do something for this project was, well, most people are creating content for these things, but what actually is this as an infrastructure? It's really just a bunch of big lights, right? It's what this thing is. It's a screen that just projects light out into this public space. And that public space actually changes radically based on that screen being there. People walk in different directions. I'm sure there's a large screen in Moscow somewhere. And you start to notice that people sort of avoid it, or there's a certain kind of route they'll take. Animals nest inside it, right? Because it's really warm. So you get these different flight patterns of birds and squirrels, and strange things start to happen in the spaces. So once they're installed all over the country, it sort of changes the landscape of the country. The other thing about them, which is kind of weird, is like they're not that attractive. They're kind of ugly objects. And this is one of the things that architects in the room probably know well, right? Like, is that people talk about media facades and media screens and all these very light-sounding things. They're not very light. They're gigantic robots that just kind of land in your city and they, don't look all that wonderful. So all of this was sort of building up a critique, right? Like, how would I kind of deal with all this stuff when I wasn't all that necessarily for the idea of installing 30 or 40 of these screens all over the place? So one of the ways that I ended up thinking about it was, could you use that projection aspect of the screen to show the world, or show people who were interested in the project what the screen saw, right? So people know what a camera obscura is. It's a kind of technique where you kind of read in the light from a real space into a very small or dark area, and it gives you a reflection of that space. So if you think of this project as basically a digital camera obscura, each of those screens has a CCTV on the top right-hand corner of it. So it's got a camera, it's got an eye. And so if we took the screen and just covered it with light, or did certain things, certain kinds of test patterns, or certain kinds of strobes, or certain kinds of whatever, you would end up with this kind of imprint, I guess, or the sort of a reflection of the space back into the screen. And it would be that kind of dynamic. It wouldn't be just about, oh, I'm showing a movie or I'm showing TV. It would be about the physical object projecting and then being read back. And so this is the kind of stuff that was on the screen. This is what we showed. Which freaked the engineers out. Like, the people were just, this is the content you produced for your art piece, But what was happening while this was happening was the camera was grabbing frames, right? So what you saw was this incredible sort of shadowscape, or a changing surface of a building, and it resulted in some wonderful sort of documentation video. And then what we did was we took all those images that we'd collected and we tried to process them and tried to look at what it was that the screen was actually seeing as a kind of digital image. And it resulted in a set of sort of exhibition pieces and media where spaces like this kind of gave you a readout of the iridescence, or the kind of the refractive index, or the reflection that was coming back from the screen. And this is, I think it's really interesting from an urban planning standpoint, from an architectural standpoint, that in a way what we're dealing with is this futurist sort of motivation to cover everything with media. But far before that point, we will basically be seeing the reflections of other media all around us, like in the beer glass that we have at a patio bar, right? Like, there'll always be an image. And so it was a bit of a critique of that kind of thing. This is just one of the prints that we made. It's a skateboarder sort of stopping and staring at the screen as it's just flashing bright white. And this is an exhibition that happened in Manchester, where we showed some of the documentation, had a live version of that piece of software running, so you could kind of see the reflection of your own face, for example, and then other pieces of documentation. So that's the general idea of my talk. What I was trying to get into that whole discussion about the works I showed is that I really think that there's a phrase that we use, for example, in Canada called action research, which is basically this idea of not thinking of research culture as something that just studies things that happen, but like we're doing with our workshop this week, that you go out in the world and you make some kind of action, and that action has kind of reverberations or resonance in that world, and that's what sort of allows you to learn about the situation. So that's my talk for today. Thanks very much. I would love if you have questions.
I was just wondering, what did you find fascinating in infrastructure? Why did you start this type of research? What was your first step? How did you get into this world? Just the inception of your research.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what my introduction was like because I couldn't understand it, but I did study engineering for quite a long time. So I was one of those people that looked at factories off the side of the road and really wanted to know what was going on inside them. But what I think probably spawned it for me is, there's this sense in which media, which is like kind of the art forms that a lot of the world that I circulated in for a while, is not implicated in infrastructure. Media is about sort of this thin layer of content that goes into this infrastructure. And I actually think it's something of a kind of ecological interest to think about all the different repercussions. Like right now, what I'm doing is spitting power on you. You know what I mean? Like these speakers are kind of like sucking power from some power station and throwing them out into your ears. And that whole chain of events is really what I think is kind of missing from a lot of design process, a lot of artistic process, to really think about, not necessarily in a guilt-laden way, but like just the repercussions of what it is that you're doing. Thank you.
Your students make works in institute, and I noticed that some projects it's collaboration with big companies like Intel and something else. How many projects that they engineering comes in life?
That's an interesting question about, again, that kind of dynamic between trying to be practical and problem-solving based. And so people know like speculative design and critical design. These are kind of areas of design that don't try to solve any problems. They're basically just like fantasy projects for 2090 when there's no gravity and we don't have to worry about oil and like these. And we always try to veer people into a more practical space. Especially because it's just kind of more satisfying, right? Like if you make up a whole world and you design for that world, it just becomes kind of like there's no constraints and it's not that interesting. So what we try to do when we work with industry partners is just propose those constraints, right? And I'm not a very practical thinker in general. So I'm usually the one pushing them kind of in more conceptual directions. But I do think that it's an important step to understanding those different dynamics. So like a lot of people don't even realize that they're being conceptual or being practical. And so really what we give them is constraints to understand where on that chain they are. And there'll be different projects depending on the company or the client. Or like Intel, for example, they're still rich. And so they have very open briefs. But if you work with like smaller companies in Denmark or in Northern Europe, they'll have very specific problems that they're trying to solve. And so there's a bunch of different dynamics. Sort of depends. Okay, thanks very much. Thank you to Strelka for having us here this week, and thank you for coming tonight.